The thing in the snow. I should have never taken that road. The storm had already swallowed the world in a blinding white void, and I could barely see past my headlights. The radio crackled uselessly, my phone had no signal, and the nearest town was miles behind me. When my tires skidded on the frozen asphalt, I knew I was in trouble. The car spun, my hands jerked the wheel, and the next thing I knew, I was half buried in a snowdrift, the engine coughing its last breath. For a long moment, I just sat there, my pulse hammering. The wind howled like a living thing, rocking the car, rattling the windows. I checked my phone again, still nothing. The temperature was dropping fast, and I knew I couldn't stay inside forever. That's when I saw it. A house. Barely visible through the heavy snowfall, its dark outline stood against the pale sky, a silhouette of safety in the middle of nowhere. I hesitated. It didn't look abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. The windows were dark, no sign of movement, no smoke from a chimney. But I had no choice. My jacket was thin, and I could already feel the cold creeping into my bones. Grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment, I pulled my scarf tight and stepped out into the storm. Each step was a battle against the wind, my boots sinking deep into the snow. I glanced behind me once, my car already disappearing beneath a fresh layer of white. My footprints trailed behind me, the only proof I had even been there. But halfway to the house, something made me stop. There were other footprints, not mine. They were scattered around the house, leading to the front door, but never away. My stomach tightened. Maybe someone else had sought shelter before me. Maybe they were inside, warming by a fire, and I was just scaring myself for no reason. That's what I told myself as I reached the porch, brushing snow off my gloves. The door creaked open when I knocked, swinging inward as if it had been expecting me. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood. The house was silent. No fire, no people. Just furniture covered in white sheets, shadows stretching long in the beam of my flashlight. The only sound was the wind rattling the windows. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. The snowstorm was screaming outside now, loud enough to drown out my own breathing. My boots left wet prints on the wooden floor as I moved deeper into the house. A grand staircase loomed ahead, leading into darkness. Doors lined the hallway, some ajar, revealing glimpses of empty rooms frozen in time. I called out, my voice hesitant. No answer. The place felt untouched, undisturbed, except for the footprints outside. My breath clouded in the dim light, the cold seeping through the walls. I checked my phone again. Dead. That's when I heard it. A single creak from the ceiling. My flashlight flickered. I aimed it upward, heart pounding. The sound had come from above me, the second floor. The house had been dead silent until now, but that noise, it had been deliberate, like a footstep. I wanted to leave. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run back into the storm, risk the cold, try to find my car again. But my legs didn't move. Something about the way the darkness stretched down the hallway, the way the silence seemed to listen, held me in place. Then the footsteps started. Not just one, multiple, slow, deliberate, moving across the ceiling directly above me. My breath hitched. They weren't heading toward the stairs. They were circling, right above where I stood. I took a step back. The floor groaned beneath me. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. Then, a sharp thud. Something heavy hit the floor upstairs, right above me. My flashlight flickered again. My hands were shaking now. I backed up toward the door, my fingers fumbling for the handle. appearing in real time, inching toward me across the wooden floor, pressing into the dust one by one. Bare footprints. They stopped a few feet away. My throat closed up. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The air had shifted, thick and heavy, as if something unseen was standing right there, staring at me. Then, another creak. The ceiling above me buckled. The wood groaned as if something was pressing down, pushing against it. I could hear breathing. Slow, rattling breaths. My flashlight caught movement, a shadow stretching long against the floor, though there was nothing to cast it. Then the whisper came. Not a voice, not words, just a slow, drawn-out exhale, like someone standing too close, their lips right against my ear. My entire body went rigid. The cold was unbearable now, sinking into my skin, locking my limbs in place. And then, the lights in the house came on. All at once, every room lit up, the hallway burning with a sickly yellow glow. The air vibrated with something unseen, something moving around me, behind me, above me. The house had awakened. I ran. I don't remember unlocking the door, don't remember stumbling down the steps. I only remember the snow swallowing me whole as I sprinted toward my car, my breath coming in panicked gasps. I reached the vehicle, clawing at the door, throwing myself inside. I turned the key. Nothing. I turned it again, harder this time. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. Headlights cut through the snow. My hands were shaking as I threw the car into reverse, backing up so fast I nearly spun out again. That's when I looked up. The house was no longer dark. Every window blazed with light, and in the upstairs window, right where I'd heard the first footsteps, stood a figure. No face, no features, just a shadow. Watching me, I slammed the gas. The tires fought for traction before finally catching, and I sped down the road without looking back. By the time I made it to the next town, my body had gone numb. Not from the cold, but from something deeper, something primal. I told the locals what had happened, expecting disbelief, maybe laughter, but their faces fell. One of them, an older man with tired eyes, shook his head. That house, he said quietly, has been abandoned for decades. I swallowed hard. No, I whispered. There were footprints. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said the words that haunt me to this day. There always are. Story number 2. Don't answer the door. The knocking started at exactly midnight. At first, I thought I imagined it. The wind had been howling through the trees all night, rattling the windows and sending gusts of snow against the cabin walls. But then I heard it again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not urgent, not frantic, just patient. I sat up in bed, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak shadows across the wooden walls. I reached for my phone, but the screen was black. Dead. The power had gone out hours ago, leaving me alone in this old cabin, miles away from the nearest neighbor. The knocking came again. This time, it was louder. I swung my legs over the bed, my pulse hammering. Who would be out here in the middle of a snowstorm at this hour? My mind raced through possibilities. A lost traveler? Someone stranded in the cold? But if that were the case, wouldn't they be calling out for help? Begging to be let in? Instead, there was only silence. Then, knock, knock, knock. I crept toward the door, my feet soundless on the wooden floor. The only light came from the dying fire, flickering weakly in the hearth. The front door was locked. I knew it was. But something about the way the knocks came, so steady, so patient, made my skin crawl. I peered through the peephole. Nothing, just darkness. My stomach twisted. The snow outside was deep. If someone had walked up to my door, there should have been footprints. But the porch was pristine, untouched. No sign of anyone standing there. And yet, knock, knock, knock. I took a step back. My breath came faster now, my body rigid with cold, and something deeper, something I refused to name. The air in the cabin felt thick, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but my phone was useless, and the landline had been dead for years. The knocking stopped. For a long moment, I stood there, waiting, straining to hear past the wind. Maybe it was over. Maybe I had imagined it, some trick of the storm. Then the doorknob turned. Slowly. A breath hitched in my throat. The lock held, but the handle twisted back and forth, testing. Someone, or something, was on the other side. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The handle stilled. Then, so quietly, I almost missed it. I heard it. A voice. Let me in. My stomach dropped. It was barely a whisper, just on the edge of hearing. A woman's voice, soft, pleading, but there was something wrong with it. Something too even, too controlled. Like someone trying very hard to sound human. I pressed my back against the wall, my fingers digging into the wood. I didn't respond. I didn't dare. Please, the voice said again. I'm so cold. I squeezed my eyes shut. I had lived in this cabin long enough to know one thing for certain. When something knocks at your door in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, you do not answer. The silence stretched. Then, ever so slowly, the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't just at the front door. It came from the back door, from the windows, from the walls. Knock, knock, knock. The air in the room turned icy, and I could feel it now. Something standing just outside every entrance, surrounding the cabin. The knocks came in unison, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Then the whispering began. Multiple voices, overlapping, too many to count. Some male, some female, some that sounded wrong. Garbled, like they were being played in reverse. My hands trembled as I grabbed the fireplace poker, gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. Not that it would help. The whispers stopped. Then came the laughter. A low, breathy chuckle, right next to my ear. I spun, swinging the poker blindly. The room was empty, but the laughter continued, now at the window, at the door, circling me. They were inside. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding. My own breath came in ragged gasps, white puffs in the freezing air. My mind screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The storm outside was relentless, an endless wall of white. A soft thud echoed behind me. I turned, and my heart nearly stopped. The footprints. Wet, bare footprints trailed across the floor, leading from the front door to the center of the room, leading right to me. But the door had never opened. I felt it before I saw it. A presence, heavy, cold, standing inches away. My breath hitched, every muscle in my body locking in place. Then finally, the whisper came again, right against my ear. Why won't you let me in? I snapped. I bolted for the door, unlocking it in a panic, throwing it open, desperate to escape. The storm howled outside, blinding me with snow. But there was no one there. Just my footprints, and another set leading away from the porch. I slammed the door shut, locking it, barricading myself inside. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, poker in hand, waiting for the sun. When morning came, I dared to step outside. The snow had covered most of the tracks, but I could still see the last few leading away from the cabin, disappearing into the trees. But they didn't fade like normal footprints. They stopped, abruptly, as if whoever had been there simply vanished. I never stayed in that cabin again. I packed my things and left, leaving the place behind, hoping to forget. But some nights, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still hear it. The knocking, waiting for me to answer. Story number 3. The Frozen Ones. They told us not to go there. Everyone in town had the same warning. Stay away from the old asylum on the hill, especially in winter, especially at night. But we were young and stupid, and when the first heavy snowfall of the season came, blanketing everything in white, we decided it was the perfect time to do the one thing everyone said we shouldn't. It was supposed to be just a dare, something to pass the time in our boring little town. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, its walls cracking under years of neglect. But inside, people said, the Frozen Ones waited. We laughed at the stories. They sounded ridiculous. Supposedly, the last patients had all died in the cold, their bodies frozen in place, standing like statues in the halls. Some claimed their spirits were trapped there, forever stuck in the moment of their deaths, unable to move. Others said the bodies were still inside, untouched by time, standing in the dark. We wanted to prove the stories wrong. The 5 of us made our way up the hill, the wind biting through our jackets, snow crunching beneath our boots. The asylum loomed ahead, a skeletal shadow against the white sky. Its doors hung open, yawning like a mouth ready to swallow us whole. Inside, it was colder than outside. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and something stale, something rotten. Our breath fogged in front of us as we stepped deeper into the darkness, flashlights sweeping across peeling walls and rusted gurneys. Then we saw them. Lining the hallway, standing in perfect rows, were the figures. At first, we thought they were mannequins. They were stiff, unmoving, their faces twisted in expressions of silent agony. But as we got closer, the realization hit us like a punch to the gut. They weren't mannequins. They were people. Their skin was pale, waxy, and their eyes, oh God, their eyes were open, glassy, frozen over, but not lifeless, like they could see us, like they knew we were there. My stomach turned. No one spoke. No one moved. We just stood there, our flashlights casting long shadows across their unmoving faces. Then from somewhere deep in the asylum, we heard it. A whisper. We turned as one, our breath catching in our throats. The sound was distant but growing louder, moving toward us, circling us. The frozen figures remained still, their dead eyes staring straight ahead. Then one of them shifted. It was slight, just the twitch of a finger, a blink, barely noticeable, but we all saw it. Panic hit like a tidal wave. Someone grabbed my arm. Someone else muttered a curse under their breath. We needed to leave. Now, but the hallway was longer than before. The entrance, just a few steps behind us moments ago, had stretched into darkness. The wall seemed closer, pressing in, the figures standing taller, their frozen expressions twisting into something else. Something hungry. The whispering turned into a low hum, vibrating through the air, through our bones. I could feel it in my chest, deep and cold, like ice spreading through my veins. My breath hitched. My feet wouldn't move. Then the lights flickered. For less than a second, everything went dark. When the lights returned, the frozen figures had moved. They were closer. They weren't lined up anymore. They were surrounding us. Their heads were tilted, their mouths slightly open, as if they were trying to speak. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Someone screamed. Someone ran. The moment their footsteps hit the ground, the whispering stopped, and the frozen ones turned their heads. All at once. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I knew was that we had to run. I grabbed my friend's sleeve and yanked. The others bolted with us, our footsteps echoing as we tore down the endless hallway. The walls blurred, the figures reaching, their movements slow, stiff, like thawing corpses waking up for the first time. The exit. Where was the exit? The door should have been right there, but the asylum had changed. It didn't want us to leave. A sharp, inhuman screech shattered the air. I turned just in time to see one of them lurch forward, its frozen limbs cracking like ice breaking apart. It shouldn't have been able to move like that. Another scream. The hallway twisted. The floor seemed to shift beneath us. Then suddenly, there it was, the entrance. The doors wide open, snow blowing inside like a beacon of escape. We didn't think. We ran. The second we crossed the threshold, the air changed. The whispering stopped. The humming ceased. The cold in my bones vanished as if it had never been there. We stumbled into the snow, gasping, hearts racing. The asylum loomed behind us, silent, motionless. I turned, breath catching in my throat. Through the shattered windows, through the cracks in the walls, I saw them. The frozen ones, watching, waiting. Their lifeless eyes locked onto us, their bodies once again stiff, unmoving. But we knew the truth now. They weren't really frozen. They were just waiting for someone to let them move again. Story number 4. The Silent Room. The first time I stepped into the silent room, I thought my ears had stopped working. The house was old, built sometime in the late 1800s, and had belonged to my great-uncle. He had died alone during the winter, his body found weeks later, frozen in his own bed. No one in the family wanted the place, so I took it. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet retreat away from the noise of the city. The first few days were normal, if you ignored the occasional creaks and groans of a house settling into winter. The wind howled against the walls at night, and the snow piled up high enough to bury my car. But inside, everything seemed fine. That was until I found the room. It was at the end of the second-floor hallway, tucked behind a door that looked no different from the others. I had walked past it a dozen times, assuming it was just another empty guest room. But when I finally opened it, something felt wrong immediately. The air inside was thick, unmoving, as if it had been trapped there for years. A layer of dust covered the wooden floor, untouched by time. But it wasn't the sight of the room that unsettled me. It was the silence. The moment I stepped inside, the world went completely, utterly silent. Not just quiet. Silence. The wind, which had been howling outside just seconds ago, disappeared. My own breathing, my own heartbeat, gone. I stomped my foot against the floor. Nothing. I snapped my fingers. Nothing. The room swallowed sound like a bottomless pit. I backed out, and the moment I crossed the threshold, everything rushed back. The wind, my heartbeat, the normal, familiar sounds of the house. I let out a shaky breath. It had to be some weird acoustic trick, I told myself. Maybe the room was built in a way that absorbed sound. That was possible, right? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About how the air in that room had felt. Heavier. Like something unseen was pressing down on me. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just a room. But then, I heard it. A soft creak. Not from the wind. Not from the old pipes. From inside the silent room. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. Another creak, followed by a slow, deliberate shift, like someone was stepping across the floorboards. But that was impossible. The room was empty. I had seen it with my own eyes. I grabbed my flashlight and crept into the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from the weak glow of the snow outside. The door to the silent room stood slightly ajar. I knew I had closed it. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself forward. Slowly, carefully, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, silence crashed down over me again. The wind vanished. My heartbeat faded. The air was thick, suffocating. And then I saw them. Footprints. They were faint, pressed into the dust on the wooden floor. Bare footprints, leading from the door to the farthest corner of the room. But no one had been in here for years. There was no reason for those prints to be there. A breath of cold air brushed the back of my neck. I spun around. Nothing. Just the empty doorway leading back into the world of sound. But something in the air had shifted. The pressure had changed. I wasn't alone. My pulse pounded, but I couldn't hear it. I reached out and snapped my fingers. Still nothing. The silence wrapped around me like a thick, smothering blanket. And then behind me, I saw it. A figure. It stood in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. Tall, unmoving, its body blending into the shadows. My flashlight flickered. The bulb dimmed, and for a second, I thought I saw a face. Hollow, empty, watching me. The floor creaked beneath my feet. The figure twitched. I ran. I didn't think, didn't breathe. I just bolted for the door, my body slamming into the hallway as sound came crashing back. My own ragged breaths, the wind outside, the frantic pounding of my heart. I turned, flashlight shaking in my grip. The room was empty. The footprints were gone. But the door was still open. I slammed it shut and locked it. Then, for good measure, I pushed a heavy dresser in front of it. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it. The weight of something watching me. The thick, crushing silence pressing in from the other side of that door. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care if I had nowhere to go. I just knew I couldn't stay in that house. But as I was packing, something stopped me cold. The door to the silent room was open again. The dresser hadn't moved. The lock was still in place. But the door itself, it was wide open, revealing the dark, soundless space beyond. And there, in the dust-covered floor, were fresh footprints, leading out of the room, leading straight to my bedroom door. Story number 5. The Whispering Fog. The first time I heard the whispers, I thought it was the wind. I had moved into the house on the edge of town just before winter, eager for peace, for quiet. It was an old place, buried under decades of snowfall, the kind of house that creaked and groaned with every shift in temperature. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, but something about my new home made people uneasy. They avoided talking about it. When I asked about the previous owners, I got vague answers, nervous glances. One old man told me, "Just keep your windows locked at night." I laughed it off at the time. Then the fog came, thick, rolling in like something alive, swallowing the street, the trees, the sky. It always came at night. By the time the clock struck 3, the world outside would disappear into a swirling white abyss. At first, I didn't think much of it. Winter brought strange weather after all. But then, one night, as I stood by my bedroom window, watching the fog creep through the trees, I heard it. A voice. At first, it was faint, barely a whisper. My name, stretched out, carried on the wind. I told myself I was imagining it. But then it came again. Closer. Clearer. I shut the window and locked it. The next night it returned. The fog slithered in at exactly the same time, a thick, suffocating wall of white. The whispering started almost immediately. At first, it was distant, coming from somewhere beyond the trees. Then it was at the edge of my yard. Then it was under my window. It wasn't just one voice. It was many. Male, female, old, young. Some were urgent, pleading. Others were amused, almost laughing. But they all said the same thing. They called my name. I stopped looking outside after that. Stopped standing near the windows once the fog rolled in. But it didn't matter. The voices knew I was inside. They knew I was listening. One night I made a mistake. I had fallen asleep on the couch, the fire burning low, my back to the window. The whispering woke me up. It was louder this time, pressing against the glass like 1,000 unseen mouths speaking at once. I held my breath. The air was thick, too still. The fire barely flickered. Then, 3 knocks at the window. I turned slowly. The fog was so dense I could barely see past the glass. But there, just beyond the swirling white, was a figure. Tall, motionless, watching. It had no face, no features, just a dark shape standing in the mist. I couldn't move. My body had locked up completely, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers grew louder. Then, the figure pressed its hand against the window. Number, not a hand, a mouth, a perfect imprint of lips pressing against the glass from the outside as if it were trying to whisper directly into my ear. The fog curled around it, shifting, almost forming more shapes, more mouths, more faces. I ran. I locked every door, every window, every crack that might let the fog seep in. I sat in the middle of my living room, gripping a fireplace poker, listening as the whispering continued. It didn't stop. Not until dawn. The next morning, I found something on my window. The imprint was still there. Not condensation. Not frost. A stain. A perfect, smeared outline of lips burned into the glass. I should have left then, but I didn't. The next night, the whispers came again. This time, they were inside the house. I woke to the sound of breathing. Slow, steady, coming from the foot of my bed. The fog was inside, swirling at the edges of the room. My blankets felt damp, heavy, as if they had been left out in the cold for hours. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then from right beside my ear, a whisper. I see you. I bolted upright, my heart nearly stopping. The room was empty. The whispering was gone. But the air was thick with something unseen, something wrong. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake until morning, gripping the fireplace poker like a lifeline. That was the last night I spent in the house, because the next day I found footprints in the snow, leading up to my window, and none leading away. Story number 6. The Snowman's Eyes. I was 8 years old when I built the snowman. It was the worst winter our town had seen in years. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones, that made the air thick and heavy with silence. The streets were buried under endless blankets of white, and school had been closed for days. My parents were stuck at work, leaving me alone with my grandfather, who never spoke much. He spent most of his time by the window, staring at the snow like he was waiting for something. Bored and restless, I decided to go outside and build a snowman. I rolled the body piece by piece, stacking it carefully near the old oak tree in our yard. It was tall, almost as tall as me. I used a tattered scarf I found in the garage, stuck 2 broken twigs for arms, and finally, I searched for something to use for the eyes. In the back corner of the shed, buried under old tools, I found them, 2 smooth, black buttons. They were larger than normal buttons, almost the size of silver dollars, and ice cold to the touch. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just pressed them into the snowman's face and stepped back, admiring my work. That was was when I noticed something strange. The snowman was facing the house, but when I had built it, I had been sure I had positioned it towards the street. I shook off the thought. Maybe I had just forgotten. Maybe I had turned it at some point without realizing it. That night, I woke up freezing. The heater in my room was working fine and my blankets were thick, but the air was different. It was the kind of cold that didn't just touch your skin. It sank deeper into your chest, your bones. Then I saw it. The scarf. It was on my floor, crumpled in a heap near the foot of my bed. My stomach tightened. I had left it on the snowman, I was sure of it. I got up slowly, my breath fogging in the air. The window was cracked open. Not much, just enough for a breeze to slip through. But I knew for a fact I had locked it before going to bed. My hands were shaking as I reached for the curtain and pulled it back. The snowman was gone. I stared at the empty space in the yard, my heart beat a slow, dull thud in my ears. The wind had picked up, sending flurries across the untouched snow. No footprints, no sign that anything had ever been there. I shut the window and crawled back into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. I told myself I had imagined it, that maybe the wind had knocked it over or the snow had swallowed it. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I didn't mention it to my grandfather. I didn't tell him about the scarf, or the window, or the empty space where my snowman had been. He wouldn't have believed me anyway. But then I saw them. The buttons. They were sitting on my windowsill, neatly placed, like someone had left them there on purpose. I ran downstairs, my heart pounding, my throat dry. My grandfather was in the kitchen, stirring his tea with slow, careful movements. When I burst in, breathless and shaking, he finally looked up. "What's wrong?" he asked. "The snowman," I whispered. "It's gone." He put his spoon down. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Something I didn't understand then. Something close to fear. He stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. He stared outside for a long time, his shoulders stiff, his hands gripping the fabric too tightly. Finally, he turned to me. "Did you take anything from the shed?" I hesitated. "Just the buttons." His face went pale. He grabbed my wrist and pulled me to the front door, yanking it open. The cold hit me like a slap. The snow was falling heavier now, covering everything in a thick, endless white. But in the middle of the yard, where the snowman had once stood, was something new. Footprints. They were deep, leading away from the empty patch of snow, dragging through the yard, past the oak tree, disappearing into the woods. They were long, uneven, as if whatever had made them hadn't been walking, but stumbling. My grandfather let go of my wrist. His breath was shaky. "Go inside," he muttered. "But now." I did as he said. I sat on the couch, staring at my hands, trying to make sense of what I had seen. When he came back inside, his boots were covered in snow, and his face was grim. He didn't say anything. He just went to the fireplace and threw the buttons in. I watched them burn. The flames turned blue for a split second before swallowing them completely. That night, I heard the knocking. Soft, slow, deliberate. I pulled my blankets over my head, squeezing my eyes shut. The wind outside howled, but beneath it, I could hear something else. A whisper. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy moving through the snow. I didn't sleep. By morning, the footprints were gone. The snow had erased them, smoothing over the yard as if nothing had ever been there. My grandfather never spoke about it again, and neither did I. Years later, after he passed, I found an old journal hidden in the attic. The pages were yellowed, filled with scribbled handwriting. Most of it didn't make sense, but one passage stood out. "They come with the snow," it read. "They take what they are given, but they always want more." I don't build snowmen anymore. Story number 7. The footsteps on the ceiling. The first night I heard the footsteps, I thought it was just the house settling. It was an old place, built long before my time, its wooden frame groaning under the weight of years. My uncle had left it to me after he passed, and with nowhere else to go, I moved in. The snow had already started falling by then, thick and endless, swallowing the town in an eerie white silence. The first few days were uneventful. The house was cold, the pipes moaned in protest every time I turned on the faucet, and the wind rattled the windows at night. But it was nothing I couldn't handle. Then came the footsteps. It was past midnight when I first heard them. Slow, deliberate, moving directly above me. I was in the living room, half asleep on the couch, when the sound pulled me back to consciousness. I frowned, staring at the ceiling. There was no second floor, just the attic. I sat up, listening. The steps moved across the ceiling, heavy and unhurried, as if someone was walking barefoot on the wooden beams above. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. Rats, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon. The attic had been locked when I moved in. I hadn't even gone up there yet. Still, the sound made my stomach twist. It wasn't skittering. It wasn't the frantic scurry of small animals. It was footsteps. I forced myself to stand, grabbed a flashlight, and climbed the attic stairs. The air grew colder with each step, my breath fogging in front of me. At the top, I hesitated, hand hovering over the latch. Then the footsteps stopped, just like that. I exhaled, forcing a laugh. My mind was playing tricks on me. I turned back, deciding to check in the morning. But as I stepped onto the stairs, a creak directly behind me. I spun around, heart slamming against my ribs, shining the flashlight into the attic. Nothing. Just dust and forgotten furniture. But the air had changed. It felt occupied. I shut the attic door and locked it. The next night, the footsteps returned. This time, they didn't stop at the attic. I was lying in bed when I heard them again. Slow, steady movements above me, pressing into the wood. My chest tightened as I stared at the ceiling. Then, to my horror, the footsteps shifted, moving down the walls. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The sound was impossible, but it was happening. The footsteps crept lower, inching toward the floor until they reached my bedroom door. Then silence. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. A hallucination brought on by isolation and too much cold. But something gnawed at me, a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. I needed proof. That night, I sprinkled flour on the floor of the attic. If it was an animal, I'd see tracks. If it was nothing, I could finally put my fears to rest. I barely slept, waiting, listening. The footsteps came as they always did, pacing the ceiling, moving in slow, measured circles above my bed. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay put. Morning came, and I climbed the attic stairs with my heart in my throat. The flashlight flickered as I pushed open the door. The flour was undisturbed, but the footprints were on the ceiling. My stomach lurched. They were clear as day, bare footprints pressed into the dust above me. Not animal tracks, not scuffs, human footprints, but upside down. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave the house and never look back. But something in me needed to know. I grabbed a chair, climbed onto it, and reached up. My fingers trembled as they brushed against the ceiling. The wood was smooth, solid, There was no way anyone had been walking up there. And yet, the prints remained. That night, I barricaded myself in my room. I shoved the dresser against the door, locked the windows, and sat in bed, clutching a kitchen knife. The air was thick with silence. I strained to listen, every nerve in my body coiled tight. Then the footsteps began, but they weren't on the ceiling anymore. They were inside my room. I choked on a breath, gripping the knife so hard my knuckles ached. The air grew colder, my breath turning to mist. The footsteps were slow, dragging, moving closer to my bed. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The weight of something unseen, standing just inches away, watching. I squeezed my eyes shut. A whisper brushed against my ear. "Why are you in my house?" I screamed. The knife dropped from my hands as I bolted upright, fumbling for the lamp. Light flooded the room, chasing away the darkness. There was nothing there but the ceiling. The footprints were gone. Instead, there was something else. A single sentence scratched into the wood. "I live below." I left that morning, shoving what little I owned into my car. I didn't care about the house, about the inheritance. I just needed to get out. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced back one last time. The attic window was open, and something was watching me leave. Story number 8, The Visitor Under the Ice. The first time I saw the thing under the ice, I thought it was just a trick of the light. The lake behind my family's old cabin had always unsettled me. Even as a kid, I never liked how still it was in winter, how the frozen surface never seemed to crack like other lakes did. My grandfather used to tell stories about it, about how the ice never fully melted even in summer, and how sometimes, if you stood too close, you'd hear whispers rising from beneath. I never believed him. Not really. But then, last winter, when I returned to the cabin alone, I finally understood what he meant. The snowstorm had cut me off from town, trapping me in the cabin for the night. The wind rattled the windows, and the fire barely fought off the cold that seeped through the old wooden walls. I had spent the evening reading, ignoring the groaning noises the cabin made, the way the air felt heavier the longer I stayed. At some point, I glanced out the back window toward the frozen lake. The moonlight made the ice glow, an endless sheet of pale blue stretching into the trees. And that's when I saw it. A shape. Beneath the ice. I frowned, leaning closer. It was faint, blurred by the thick frost, but it was there. Something dark, motionless just below the surface. It almost looked like a person. A chill crawled up my spine, and I shook my head. My mind was playing tricks on me. The storm, the isolation, it was making me see things. But as I turned away, something shifted. The shape moved. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't imagining it. It was shifting under the ice, slowly, like it was turning over. I swallowed hard, pressing my forehead against the cold glass. And then it opened its eyes. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The thing under the ice was looking at me. 2 black, hollow eyes, deep and empty, staring straight into mine. My hands shook, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Then it started rising. The ice didn't break, it didn't crack, but the figure was moving, floating closer to the surface, its face stretching into something unnatural, something wrong. I ran. I don't know why, but I grabbed my jacket and boots, yanking them on with shaking hands. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run as far from that lake as possible. But something about those eyes, that frozen, waiting expression, I needed to see if it was real. The wind howled as I stepped outside, my boots crunching in the snow. The lake was completely still, the ice smooth, untouched. I hesitated at the edge, my breath clouding in front of me. Nothing. The figure was gone. My body relaxed slightly. Maybe it really had been my imagination. Maybe. Then I saw them. Footprints, leading from the edge of the lake to where I stood. But they weren't mine. My blood ran cold. The steps were deep, imprinted in the snow, but they didn't lead away from the lake. They led out of it. I turned to run. Something grabbed my ankle. I hit the ground hard, the cold knocking the air from my lungs. My vision blurred, my pulse hammering in my ears. The snow beneath me was wet, soaking wet, like something had been dragged across it. I scrambled to my feet, kicking wildly. The lake was just feet away, dark and endless, the footprints leading straight from its frozen depths. But there was nothing there, just silence. Then the whisper came, low, raspy, curling around me like breath against my ear. Come back. I ran. I don't remember getting inside, don't remember locking the door. All I know is that I spent the rest of the night by the fire, my hands gripping the poker, my ears straining for any sound. By morning, the footprints were gone. The snow had covered them, smoothing over everything as if nothing had ever been there. But when I looked out at the lake one last time, I saw something new. Not footprints, handprints, pressed against the inside of the ice. Story number 9. The Vanishing Town. I shouldn't be alive to tell this story. I was driving through the mountains trying to outrun the worst snowstorm I'd ever seen. The roads were barely visible, the wind howling so loud it drowned out my thoughts. My phone had lost signal hours ago, and I hadn't seen another car in miles. The gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, and the idea of being stranded in the middle of nowhere made my stomach twist. Then, through the blinding snow, I saw lights. A town. I don't remember seeing it on the map, but I didn't care. Relief washed over me as I turned onto the main road, the town emerging from the storm like a forgotten memory. It was small, lined with old brick buildings and glowing street lamps. Snow-covered cars sat parked along the curbs, and warm lights flickered from shop windows. It looked untouched by the storm. I pulled into a small diner near the center of town, the neon open sign buzzing weakly. As soon as I stepped inside, warmth wrapped around me, a stark contrast to the brutal cold outside. The place looked like something out of time. Worn leather booths, a long counter with faded bar stools, the faint hum of an old jukebox in the corner. A handful of people sat scattered around, sipping coffee, eating pie. They barely looked up when I entered. A waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, approached me with a small, polite smile. "You must be freezing," she said, handing me a cup of coffee before I even ordered. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic. "Got caught in the storm," I muttered. "Didn't even know this town was here." The woman's smile faltered just a little. Not many people do. Something in the way she said it sent a small prickle down my spine. I glanced around, noticing how still everything was. The people in the diner weren't talking, just quietly eating, staring at their plates. The air felt thick, like a room that had been locked up for too long. I cleared my throat. "Is there a motel around here? Somewhere I can stay the night?" The waitress hesitated. "There's a place down the road," she said, voice softer now. "Just don't go out after midnight." I frowned. "Why?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, shaking her head. "Storm gets worse. Best to stay inside." I didn't push. I was too tired, too cold. I finished my coffee, left a few crumpled bills on the counter, and made my way to the motel. It was small, just 6 rooms lined up in a row, the office barely more than a shed. The old man at the front desk barely looked at me as he slid the key across the counter. "Checkouts at sunrise," he muttered. I nodded, too exhausted to care. The room was basic. Bed, nightstand, tiny TV that flickered between static and an old black and white movie. I pulled off my boots, stretched out on the bed, and let the exhaustion take over. Sometime later, I woke up. Something wasn't right. The air was still. Too still. The heater had stopped working and the room was ice cold. My breath fogged in front of me as I sat up, listening. Then I heard it. A voice. Faint, distant, just outside my window. I stood slowly, heart pounding, and pulled back the curtain. The town was gone. Not covered in snow. Not hidden by the storm. Just gone. The diner, the streetlights, the buildings. Nothing but endless, untouched snow stretching into the darkness. My stomach twisted violently. I turned, grabbed my coat, and threw open the door. The parking lot was gone. My car was gone. The motel itself. Only my room remained. The others had disappeared, swallowed by the storm. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Then I saw them. Figures standing in the snow, just beyond the reach of the dim porch light. They weren't moving, just watching. I couldn't see their faces, only the dark outlines of their bodies against the endless white. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through my bones, growing louder, sharper. Then, all at once, they moved. Not walking, not running, gliding toward me. I slammed the door shut, locking it, shoving the nightstand in front of it. The humming was inside my skull now, pressing against my mind, drowning out my thoughts. The room grew darker. The walls felt smaller. And then, silence. The air shifted, like something had just left. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Morning came slowly, dragging itself into existence. When the first light touched the window, I finally dared to look outside. The town was back. The buildings, the street, the diner, as if nothing had happened. But the snow was untouched. No footprints, no tire tracks, like I had been the only person there. I left without checking out, without stopping for coffee, without looking back. I drove for hours until I reached the next town, nearly crashing into a gas station in my desperation to see another human face. The clerk looked up as I stumbled inside, panting, wild-eyed. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. I licked my lips, still shaking. Small town, back on Highway 14. The clerk's face went blank. "There ain't no town on Highway 14. I started to argue, to insist, but then I saw the look in his eyes. I wasn't the first person to say that. And I wouldn't be the last. Story number 10. The Smiling Reflection. I was brushing my teeth when I first noticed it. At first it was nothing. Just my reflection staring back at me, tired and pale under the dim bathroom light. The winter cold had been brutal that year, and the pipes groaned whenever I turned on the faucet. I had been staying at my grandmother's old house for a week, looking after it while she was in the hospital. The place had always felt a little off to me, but I chalked it up to childhood fears. I spat into the sink and reached for the towel. When I looked up, my reflection was still brushing its teeth. My breath caught in my throat. It lasted less than a second, just a flicker of wrongness. But I saw it. My own face, lagging behind like a bad video, mouth moving when I was already still. I took a step back, my heart pounding. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was a trick of the dim light. The mirror was old, slightly warped, the glass fogging at the edges. I turned off the light and left the bathroom. That night, I barely slept. The wind howled against the house, rattling the windows, seeping through the cracks. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, but no matter how much I tried to relax, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next morning, I avoided the bathroom mirror altogether. I splashed water on my face without looking up, refusing to acknowledge the feeling creeping up my spine. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. The mirror was smudged. Not with fingerprints, not with dust, with breath. Like someone had been standing too close, breathing heavily against the glass. I swallowed hard, wiping it away with a shaking hand. The reflection looked normal. It looked like me, but I still felt watched. That night I dreamed of mirrors. Endless, stretching mirrors filling the walls of a long, dark hallway. In them, my reflection stood, waiting, smiling. I woke up drenched in sweat, the room freezing cold. The wind was still howling, but something felt different. The air was heavier, pressing against my skin. My breath came fast, uneven. I forced myself to calm down, but the unease gnawed at me. I needed water. I padded down the hallway, the wooden floors cold against my feet. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of settling wood. As I passed the bathroom, something made me stop. The door was open. I knew I had closed it. The light was off, but the mirror caught just enough glow from the street lamp outside. My reflection was barely visible, just a faint outline in the darkness. Then it moved. Not a trick of the light. Not a delayed reaction. It moved before I did. I sucked in a sharp breath, my body frozen. The figure in the mirror took a slow step forward, out of sync with me. My hands trembled at my sides. Then it smiled. Not my smile. Not forced. Not natural. A wide, unnatural grin stretching too far, teeth too white, lips curling at the edges like something imitating human expression. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The reflection's head tilted slightly, watching me, waiting. I ran. I don't remember reaching my bedroom, don't remember slamming the door shut. I just knew I couldn't look, couldn't see it again. The next morning, the mirror was normal. No smile, no wrong movements. But the breath marks were back. And this time, they weren't just on the glass. They were on my bedroom window, too. From the inside, story number 11, The House That Waits. They told me never to go near the old house on the hill. Every winter, when the snow buried the roads and the wind howled through the valley, the warnings returned. My grandfather was the first to say it, his voice low, his gaze distant. That house waits, he told me once, and it doesn't forget who steps inside. I thought it was just an old man's story, the kind meant to scare children away from trouble. But deep down, I knew the house was different. It wasn't abandoned like the others. It wasn't crumbling or boarded up. It stood there, watching, the windows dark and waiting. One night, when the storm was at its worst, I made the mistake of going inside. I had been driving home from a friend's place when the blizzard swallowed the road. The snow was thick, the wind so strong I could barely see past my headlights. My car struggled against the ice, the tires skidding with every turn. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered and died. Panic set in. The storm was relentless and the cold was already creeping into my bones. My phone had no signal and the nearest town was miles away. Then I saw it. The house. It stood at the top of the hill, untouched by the storm, its dark roof barely dusted with snow. I didn't think. I just ran. My boots sank into the snow with every step, the wind tearing at my jacket. The house loomed larger with each stride, its front door slightly ajar as if it had been left open just for me. The moment I stepped inside, the storm vanished. Not just the wind, not just the snow. Everything. The world outside was gone, replaced by a suffocating silence. The air was thick, heavy with something unseen. The house smelled of old wood and dust, but underneath there was something else. Something rotten. I turned to leave. The door was gone. Not closed. Gone. My breath hitched. The hallway stretched ahead, too long, too dark. The flickering chandelier above cast weak, sickly light against the walls, making the shadows move in ways they shouldn't. A whisper slid through the air. I spun around, my pulse hammering. The house was empty, but I wasn't alone. Somewhere in the darkness, something was waiting. I forced myself forward, my boots echoing against the wooden floor. The air grew colder with every step. Doors lined the hallway, each identical, each slightly ajar. Then from one of them, a creak. Slow, deliberate, like someone shifting their weight just beyond the threshold. I held my breath. My fingers trembled as I reached for the nearest doorknob. The whispering grew louder. I pushed the door open. The room was empty, at least at first. Then I saw them. The footprints, pressed into the dust-covered floor, leading from the doorway to the center of the room. But no one was there. A sharp chill crawled up my spine. The whispers had stopped. The air felt wrong. Then from behind me, the floor creaked. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body locking in place. There at the end of the hallway stood a figure, tall, motionless, featureless, its head tilted, almost curious. Then, all at once, the doors slammed shut. I ran. I don't remember how I got to the stairs, only that my feet barely touched the ground. The air around me vibrated with something unseen, something moving just behind me. The house was alive, shifting, warping, trying to keep me inside. As I reached the bottom of the staircase, I saw it. The door. It was back, but it wasn't open. Something stood in front of it, tall, watching, waiting. The air turned heavy, pressing against my chest. The whispering returned, curling around me like fingers in my hair. "Stay," it sighed. I lunged forward, my body screaming for escape. The thing at the door didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilting again as if it was amused. I slammed into the door, my hands scrambling for the knob. The whispering grew frantic, urgent. Hands, not mine, grasped at my coat, my wrists, my shoulders. I turned the knob. The house breathed, and then I was outside. The storm hit me like a wall, snow blinding, wind cutting through me like knives. My car was there, headlights still on, engine running. The house was behind me, standing silent, unchanged. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was behind the wheel, hands shaking as I floored the gas. The tires spun, caught, and I tore down the road, the house vanishing behind a curtain of white. I never went back. But sometimes, on winter nights, I wake up with the taste of dust in my mouth, and I hear the whisper. The house still waits. If you made it this far, you're braver than most. But tell me, have you ever experienced something unexplainable? A shadow where there shouldn't be one? A whisper in the dark? Share your horror stories in the comments below. I'll be reading them. And if you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the other horror stories appearing on your screen. You never know. The next story might just be about you.